So the fundamental concept and overarching principle to this talk is that passwords suck. Right? I mean, I'm not saying anything that's out of the ordinary, right? I mean, if you deal with any sort of Windows systems administration and you have to deal with passwords, at any point you know that they are the bane of our existence. We have to deal with them in terms of provisioning, lifecycle management, ensuring that users are doing the right thing with them, ensuring that they're not giving them away. The entire ecosystem around managing passwords is just really awful. And so there's a number of things that we can do, and obviously Microsoft is trying to make our lives easier with that by trying to effectively squash it. So what is the fundamental problem with passwords? Well, the real root of the problem and the real core, the actual technical problem with passwords is that they are symmetric. When you get right down to it, passwords are shared and stored. And this is the fundamental problem, is that anytime we do that, we have to store these passwords in a central location by design, right? The identity provider being Azure Active Directory or on-premises Active Directory, or if it's something else like a SQL database or an LDAP database or something like that, fundamentally, those passwords have to exist in one location. And importantly, and this is an important distinction, the authentication process is such that I have to send my password to the central repository for it to be validated. And that poses a number of problems because it can be manipulated or captured or compromised in a variety of different ways. And of course, since this central repository contains passwords for everybody in the whole enterprise, it becomes a rich target. When attackers get into your network, not if but when, they're going for the repository. They're going for your domain controllers. That is the keys to the kingdom, right? If they can get to a domain controller and compromise that database, they have everything they need. And by the way, we're fooling ourselves if we don't understand that credentials are the #1 thing attackers are after. You know, if you listen to a lot of the security vendors and they talk about all the subtleties and nuances of these super stealthy attacks, at the end of the day, that attacker needs some credentials to get into and onto your network. They need credentials to move laterally in your network. Ultimately, what are they looking for? Privileged credentials, so that they can gain access to what it is that they're after, ultimately your data. And if they can compromise an Active Directory database, jackpot, game over. And so at that point, if you're compromised and your AD is compromised, it's a sad state of affairs. Because now you've basically lost all integrity for your Active Directory, and so at that point you're probably left to rebuild. So, complicating things further, of course, is that passwords are often easy to guess. Even if they're long and complex, sometimes they're easy to guess because we can, of course, we can use things like rainbow tables, we can use password dumps from data breaches, which you can get readily on the internet. There's a variety of ways in which you can guess. By the way, social media makes this really easy, right? So if you go to somebody's, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you can learn a lot about somebody, and you can probably guess that, hey, maybe it is the name of their dog, or some sort of sport that they like, or their team that they follow, those types of things. There's a lot of things that make passwords easy to guess, even though they might appear to be complex. They're easily stolen in a variety of different ways. They can be disclosed or they can be captured. Disclosed meaning the user voluntarily shares their password. So, and by the way, I've not been guilty of this myself. I've never done this, but I do have had colleagues in the past that would do this. Hey Bob, here's my password and my username. Can you log out of this system and do this work for me? I mean, that's just suicide. But people do it. And if IT administrators will do it, end users will do it, right? Of course, they can be disclosed surreptitiously, in other words, through a phishing attack. And honestly, phishing attacks are pretty common, one. Two, they're prevalent because they work, unfortunately. Users or attackers will send a pretty compelling email, and even sometimes not very compelling, but users can be naive. And they click on the thing because they say, oh, my password does need to be reset, or I have been compromised. I better click on this and enter my username and password, that sort of thing. It's not difficult. And I've had in the past, I had the privilege of working with a company that does the phishing campaigns, right? So a company called PhishMe. Basically, they send those emails out to your organization, and then they monitor, what kind of success they had. And it's downright scary when you see how easy it is to get users to give up their password. And sometimes it takes nothing more than calling them and asking for it. I've heard certainly they have some sessions at Black Hat where they do that. I've not been to Black Hat, but I've seen this on some YouTube videos where literally somebody gets in a booth, starts calling people, and in a matter of minutes they've got credentials. So it is very easy to compromise credentials, passwords specifically. Making things even more challenging is that users tend to reuse these passwords. So once these passwords are compromised, it's often easy to then just log into a bunch of other services. My kids hopefully are no longer doing this, but this is something that they've been guilty of, and my wife, I've tried to school them and to teach them how to use password databases, certainly in-laws and things like that. But this is really a very serious challenge. Your credentials are compromised, your password is then part of a data breach, and that's the same password that you use to get into Facebook and Hulu and Instagram and Netflix and your bank. Those types of things. It's real easy for the user, right? I only have to remember one password. Even if it's long and complex, and even if it's a great password, now that it's been compromised and I'm using it across services, now I have a real problem. The attacker compromises that password, and then of course, let's try to log into their bank, or better, their email, change their email password, and then reset all their passwords at their banks and things like that. So you can see where that's going. Reusing passwords is obviously fundamentally really bad. Passwords that are not changed for periods of time or are changed from the default is a real challenge as well. I think that there's a special place in hell for appliance or any sort of developer that has a password as a part of their application that doesn't make the user change it immediately. So most of the security appliances that I deal with, it's one of the first things you have to do. You log in with whatever default credentials that come with the virtual appliance or the physical appliance, and immediately you have to change it. Good on you, right? But too often, and it's certainly less prevalent, but it's certainly historically been a real problem, they don't make you change it, and then of course administrators get lazy and leave the defaults, and then pretty soon it's in production and you're on to the next project, and you've forgotten that the username is something that everybody can look up on the internet real quickly, right? So, or something easily guessable or not very complex. So a lot of challenges with that. Passwords can also be common. What we have found from, if there's been one positive thing that's come from all these data breaches over the last number of years, is that we as security people have gained an insight into what kinds of passwords users are actually using. And so the more information that pours in from these breaches, the more information that we have that says, hey, these are the top passwords. I'm sure we've all seen them. You can probably just Google or Bing that real quick and find out what the most common passwords are. And they're things like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and stupid things like that. So that's another challenge that we face as administrators, is trying to get users to use good passwords. Now, as an aside, Microsoft has implemented some really good technologies in terms of Azure AD and things like that, even integrates with on-premises AD to be able to prevent users from using those types of passwords. Like, for example, if you try to spin up a service in Azure and use a password like password P @SSW0RD, the one we always use for our test labs, right? They won't let you do that. Even though that does qualify technically as a long, complex password, it does have a fair amount of entropy. At the end of the day, it is not something that you would want to use, and those services do prevent you from doing that. So there's some capabilities there, but again, this is just one more thing that makes passwords a challenge for us on a daily basis as security administrators. So, what's the solution? Well, historically, it's been stronger passwords, right? So as when I first got into this field, of course, you learn very quickly and early on as a Windows administrator that, you need to have a strong password policy for your domain. We need to have passwords that are long and that are complex. And we tend to want to make users change them on a regular basis. Historically, that's been frequently. Certainly for privileged access, it might be, even, days and weeks or months or something like that. For general users, sometimes not so much. But there's been, and the reason I have an asterisk here, is that there's been some research lately that shows that there's strong evidence that changing passwords, at least for ordinary users on a frequent basis, may actually do more harm than good. There is, by the way, if you download the slide deck, and I would encourage you to download the slide deck because I did make some changes and I found some errors in it. So I did make some changes to the deck, so please re-download that if you want. But there is some information, a couple of links to that research at the end of this slide deck if you want to look at that. So we made passwords long, complex. We made our users' lives miserable, right? Because they had to manage these ridiculous passwords. And what did they do? They generally write them down and stick them to their keyboard and do those types of things, make our lives even more challenging. So we decided, hey, let's throw multi-factor authentication on top of that. So this was the answer as well, right? So long, complex passwords weren't enough. Let's make the user do something else to prove they are who they are. And I'll be honest with you, and I don't want to knock MFA. MFA has its place, but it's really an add-on to passwords. It doesn't solve our password problem. It masks one part of the password problem. Multi-factor authentication at its core is really a Band-Aid approach. It addresses the symptom. It doesn't solve the actual problem of passwords. Everything that we talked about up to this point doesn't get solved with MFA. It just gets mitigated, right? So yeah, a password could get compromised, but if it does, it's of no value to an attacker because they would also need to then know the PIN or the token or what have you. Making things worse is that multi-factor authentication systems tend to be very complex. By the way, anybody here, and then I go back to my days when I used to work for the Bank of America, and we had RSA. RSA is the poster child for complexity in an enterprise. Anybody here use RSA for multi-factor authentication in their organization? There's a few. Not trivial to implement or manage, administer, maintain. It is an extremely complex solution. Also very, very costly. Those solutions are not inexpensive. And by the way, they tend to really break the user experience. They tend to make users' lives miserable. And I'll be honest with you, as security administrators, that tends to be our goal, right? In other words, sometimes we feel like we're not doing our job unless we're making users' lives more difficult. And that's the beauty of Windows Hello for Businesses. Actually, it's a win-win in that it's going to make it more secure and easier to use, which is a very rare experience. Now, poor user experience, meaning, of course, I have to have the token, I have to have the software on my phone. I'll admit that this is getting better. I mean, there are solutions out there like Duo that are pretty, easy to integrate, not terribly difficult. Modern smartphones and applications have made it easier. For example, Azure MFA, Duo, SafeNet, Gemalto, all of those solutions have some sort of push notification, even PointSharp has it, where I can log into a system and all I need to do is get this note or get this message on my phone and accept the login. Do you accept the login, press the button, go. So it is getting better and getting easier, but it is still, again, a Band-Aid approach. It's still additional to passwords, and it doesn't solve the core problem of passwords. So, you might ask about smart cards. Smart cards were supposed to be the answer a number of years ago, and I do remember being involved in some projects to look at deploying this enterprise-wide. The challenge with smart cards, of course, is that they too are complex, expensive, and often cause more problems than they solve. So now I have this a smart card, which is basically a private key stored on a physical card, The nice thing about that is that it tends to be very secure, but then I have to have all of the infrastructure to provision it. I have to deal with lost or stolen cards, users forgetting their card, those types of things. At the end of the day, it can be problematic. And of course, smart card readers are not in every laptop in the world. Certainly back in the day they weren't, so you had to provision additional hardware for it. So didn't really work. Now Microsoft, of course, came out with virtual smart cards. That was supposed to be the answer. I don't know if anybody did any work with that. Virtual smart cards had some initial promise. The death of virtual smart cards were that there was no easy way to deploy that at scale. There wasn't a good system to really deploy that. So if you had to do it on a limited basis, it was decent, but at the end of the day, it became real problematic. So you might be asking yourself, and certainly I have, why in the world are we still using passwords? Passwords are miserable. They make our lives miserable. They have all these problems. Why today, in almost 2019, are we still using passwords? Passwords have been around since the dawn of computing, right? All of this intelligence and all this cool stuff that we build, we can't figure out some better way to do this other than passwords. Of course, is it possible, of course, and I'll ask the question, is it possible to get to a world where we don't have passwords, yet still have security? I mean, we get rid of passwords tomorrow by just saying, hey, everybody's password is blank, right? Not going to help us. Helps the attackers, doesn't help us. So, enter Windows Hello for Business. By the way, Windows Hello is something that we may or may not be familiar with. Windows Hello is really nothing more than the biometric sign-in experience that is a part of Windows 10. It's what allows you to log in with your face recognition or your fingerprint or a PIN. Windows Hello for Business is the extension of Windows Hello for the enterprise. It allows us to then authenticate against Azure Active Directory or on-premises Active Directory in the same manner and do so in a much more secure way. It is more secure and much more effective than traditional passwords because it is asymmetric. And this is, I think this is really crucial, is that there is no central storage for Windows Hello. So we get rid of the central repository of a collection of passwords that presents that rich target for attackers that I talked about before. So now we have a distributed, basically, password system or authentication system. It leverages public key cryptography, modern science. Some really smart math people got together many years ago and came up with public key cryptography, asymmetric cryptography, and we essentially use that for the authentication process. Importantly, Windows Hello for Business is device-based, meaning my credentials are tied to my device. This is how we get away from the central storage. My credentials are only valid on this device. If they were to be compromised, they would be absolutely useless to you because you don't have my device. And I think that's the real importance here. Whereas passwords are centrally located and I can use that credential from anywhere in the world, Windows Hello for Business decentralizes that, uses asymmetric encryption, and ties the credential to the device, meaning my credentials are only valid on this physical device. If I have another device, if I have to log on to this laptop, there are different credentials tied to this device. It is multi-factor authentication by default. Since it is device-based, the something you know or something you are equation of multi-factor authentication is your PIN, your fingerprint, or your face, your mug for the camera. All of those things are the something you know or something you are half of the multi-factor or two-factor authentication equation. The something you have is the physical device. It's been provisioned for Windows Hello for Business, and optionally and additionally, you actually can use the Microsoft Authenticator app to even further bolster the security of the login. So what you'll see later is we're going to use a PIN for login. You can actually make it so that you have to have the PIN and the token to authenticate to the laptop. And I'll explain a little bit more how that works just shortly. Actually, right now. So how does Windows Hello for Business work? As I'd mentioned before, there's a public key. Well, let me back up. When you provision Windows Hello for Business, there is a part of the provisioning process generates a key pair, an asymmetric key pair, meaning a public key and a private key. In this type of cryptography, we share freely the public key, because it's public, and the private key is, of course, a closely guarded secret. By closely guarded, I mean it's actually going to be stored in the TPM, so in the Trusted Platform module on our device. So with the private key in the TPM, we have high assurance that those credentials cannot be compromised. By the way, as an aside, it is possible to do Windows Hello for Business without TPM. I would strongly discourage that, because storing private keys in software doesn't really provide a lot of assurance, meaning that if this machine is compromised, any user who either has administrative rights or can elevate to administrative rights can compromise those keys. They're just about useless in that scenario. You don't ever have 100% assurance that any device, if it's ever been connected to a network, has not been compromised at some point. And so I would implore you, if you're considering Windows Hello for Business, please, please, please tie your credentials to the TPM, and I'll show you how to do that a little bit later. It's really where the value and the benefit of this solution comes from. So, private key is stored in the TPM. In the private key itself is encrypted with what's known as a protector key, which we unlock using our biometric or our gesture. So the PIN or my fingerprint or my face recognition unlocks the private key. The private key is used as a part of a signing operation. So in other words, technically how this works is the client machine will send an empty authentication request to the identity provider, being Azure AD or on-premises AD. It will respond with a challenge. That challenge gets signed with our private key. As a part of that provisioning process, our public key is actually stored in the identity provider. So it's not our credential, it's just half of our key pair. When the client machine will perform the signing operation with its private key, again stored in the TPM. When it gets to the identity provider, if it can then decrypt it with my public key, it knows that I'm actually the one who made that request. That's the way it fundamentally works. And it does so without passing my credentials. I just simply prove that I have the private key. And then I'm allowed to, of course, at that point, if it's Active Directory, for example, there is a ticket that's granted. That ticket is encrypted with my public key, sent to the client, it decrypts it with its private key, boom, I have a Kerberos ticket. And I did so without transmitting my credentials or typing them in on a password on the machine. So you can see that it is much, much more effective, much stronger, and much higher level of assurance than traditional passwords. Now, for Windows Hello for Business, there are a number of different deployment models. And this is where I really struggled, because in the context of this talk, about an hour, I really can't go over all of them. I had to make a decision on what to focus on. And so the decision I made, we're going to see if I'm right. We're going to see if I guessed I chose what I believe to be a fairly common, or what I think should be a common scenario. We're going to find out. We'll do a quick poll here in just a minute. But there are a couple of different deployment models. First is cloud only, meaning you have no on-premises AD. You are purely Azure AD, and all your devices are Azure AD joined. In this case, you need to have Windows 10, 15, 11, or later. Hopefully, if you're on Windows 10, you are way past 15, 11. You should be. You would obviously have to have an Azure account. You would need to have Azure AD provisioned. You can actually do this with the free version of Azure AD. The premium version is recommended for the best experience and to get all the features and capabilities, but you can do it with the free. And also, if you've deployed Office 365, then you have an Azure AD, you can actually use that Azure AD as well. You should also enable Azure MFA. Part of the provisioning process requires a multi-factor authentication challenge, because when we're provisioning the device, we want the highest level of assurance to know that this user is actually who they say they are the first time. There's a hybrid deployment model, and there's a couple of different ways to do this. The first is what's known as key trust. hybrid deployment with key trust, meaning the requirements are the same as the cloud, as we just talked about. Key trust being that the keys, those signing keys that we talked about before that are stored in the TPM, those keys are tied to the hardware device and they are generated by the operating system. That's key trust. There's also an option to do certificate trust. And again, as I mentioned at the outset, this is kind of what drew me into the Windows Hello for Business arena in the first place, is because I have PKI experience. Now, certificate trust is optional. And if you're doing certificate trust and you have hybrid Azure AD, in other words, you have on-premises Active Directory to which your computers are joined to that domain, but are also registered in Azure AD, then it requires Windows 17.03 or later. The Microsoft recommended guidance is to use 17.09 for the best experience. If you're just doing pure Azure AD join, then again it goes back to the cloud-only requirements where you just need 15.11. If you're going to do hybrid, and I think this is probably going to be the most common deployment scenario, you do have to have a Windows Server 2016 Active Directory schema. So hopefully this doesn't scare too many people away. You must also have some Windows Server 2016 domain controllers. The number of those depends on how many authentication requests you expect to handle for Windows Hello for Business. Windows Hello for Business will seek out your Server 2016 domain controller. So what it means is that you don't have to have all of your domain controllers converted to Windows Server 2016, but you need to have some in your organization in order to, one, get to Server 2016 schema, two, to support authenticating Windows Hello for Business. You must be at least the Windows Server 2008 R2 Forest functional level. Hopefully everybody's at least at that point today. And finally, if you're going to use certificate services, if you're going to do the certificate trust, you will need to have Server 2012 or later PKI. So if your PKI is still running Server 2008 R2, of course you won't be able to do this. There is an on-premises only deployment model. I would probably discourage you from looking at this, but again, it is available to you. You do have to have 1703 or later, but again, you still have to have Server 2016 schema, domain controllers, 2008 R2 force function level, and you need to have a 2012 or later PKI. I put this slide up here mostly so that you can view this when you download the deck. I realize this is difficult to see in the room, so don't necessarily worry about it. But a reason I put this up here is because I wanted to demonstrate that for my purposes, for the purposes of this talk, I chose to use the Key Trust Group Policy Management deployment scenario. Again, there's all sorts of permutations of how you can implement this. This is the one I chose, and the reason I chose it is this. In my test lab, all of my domain controllers are Server 2016. I'm obviously running 2016 Forest functional level, and of course the schema and everything like that. I have an on-premises Active Directory. I am integrated with Azure Active Directory, so I have Azure AD Connect installed, and I'm synchronizing to the cloud, and I'm synchronizing some users and some computers to the cloud. Not everything, but some. So my question to you is this. How many of you are running Azure Active Directory and Active Directory Sync? Show of hands? Fair amount of people. How many of those folks still have or are running Server 2016 domain controllers? So a few, okay. All right. So some of you got a little bit of work to get to the deployment model that I'm going to use. Once you see how easy this is, you'll want to get there. You may even want to hold off on a Windows Hello for Business deployment until you get to this, until you meet these requirements, because what you'll see is that it actually is fairly simple. And I was actually surprised because when I first became exposed to this technology, looking at certainly some of the initial documentation like this, I thought, oh dear God, you know, we're going to have, there's a lot of stuff. I'm doing this without PKI, I'm doing it without ADFS. And you'll see that everything functions just fine. So as long as you have Server 2016 domain controllers and meet those Active Directory requirements, you're using Azure AD Sync and you're syncing to, have Azure AD Connect and you're syncing to the cloud, and using Active Directory group policy to manage this, you'll see that there's a few GPO settings and a couple of things that are required to do that, and you're off to the races, and it actually works fairly well. And it's not terribly complex. It gets really complex when you don't meet some of those requirements. By the way, you can actually do this you can actually even support Windows 7 clients. Not something I've done, not something I would probably encourage you to do. I would say probably a good time to get off of Windows 7, because obviously its support lifetime is coming up on its sunset, but at the end of the day, it is possible. I won't talk about it here because I tend not to encourage people to use Windows 7. So as I said, you have to have Azure AD Connect. I'm not going to go into the whole process of installing and configuring Azure AD Connect, but the assumption here, of course, is that you have it installed, configured, and you're syncing at least some users and computers to Azure AD. By the way, importantly, for Windows Hello for Business to work, the computer must be Azure AD joined in some fashion, right? So there's a couple of different models, right? So in my lab, my machines are domain joined and then registered or synchronized to Azure AD. And of course, there's an automated way to do that. I'm going to show you how to do that as well. But fundamentally, you must have Azure AD. The devices must be registered in Azure AD. So with Azure AD Connect, of course, I'm going to assume that you've gone through the standard installation process and you're syncing ADs, or syncing IDs and computers. Once you've done that, you actually need to support Windows Hello for Business. You need to go back in, rerun the deployment wizard, and choose a couple of extra options. So the first, of course, is go into the additional settings, go into run the tool, and then go to additional tasks. And then you're going to select the option to do configure hybrid Azure AD join in my deployment scenario. At that point, you're going to be asked to configure the service connection point. So the SCP is what those client machines are going to use to identify your Azure AD. And of course, the assumption here, I think, is that you are an enterprise admin. If you are not, you can download a PowerShell script and have your enterprise admins run that. But fundamentally, if you have the permissions to do this now, you literally just click next and it does everything for you. And at that point, you're off to the races. Here's where you select your device operating systems. I chose Windows 10 only, simply because my lab doesn't have any Windows 7, but you can support down-level clients if you so choose. So once that's done, and by the way, I would also encourage you not to sync every ID and every computer account in your on-premises AD with the cloud. I tend to target and favor targeting specific OUs so that I synchronize specific users and specific devices. Like, for example, I don't want every workstation or every server in my enterprise to be synchronized to the cloud. I don't need that. But I do want all my workstations to do that so I can take advantage of Windows Hello for Business. So next, we need to configure some group policy objects, and there's two of them that are crucial. The first is a group policy object that forces, or essentially, all of my client machines for which this group policy applies to automatically register with Azure AD. And this is magic, because this really does make the job of provisioning Windows Hello for Business much easier. So it is in Computer Configuration, Policies, Administrative Templates, Windows Components, Device Registration, and it is as easy as just selecting the enabled option. So if we take a look at this, jump over here, and in Group Policy, I've got a Group Policy object, Hybrid Azure AD Join, already set up. So I'm going to edit this GPO real quick and just show you where this is at. So Policies, Windows Settings, Administrative Templates, Windows Components, should be under here. And I already forgot where it was. Windows Components, Device Registration, not Hybrid Device Registration. There it is. Great. And it's really simple. There's just one, register domain computers as devices. Real simple. set this enabled, and of course target that at the OU that you wish to use. So I have like a managed computers OU, I think. I just drop it on that OU, and anybody in that particular OU will automatically get registered with Azure AD. So that's the first one. So that's the crucial one. Once we've got everybody, all of our client machines, of course, joined to Azure AD, again, that's the first step, then we need to implement the Windows Hello for Business settings. Implementing those settings is actually fairly simple as well. We have computer configuration policies, administrative templates, Windows components, and there's Windows Hello for Business, and the operative one here, of course, is use Windows Hello for Business. There's actually a policy that you actually tell it to use Windows Hello for Business. So taking a look at that, it looks like this. Let's see here. Windows Hello for Business. And the first one, of course, the most crucial one here is, oh, this is the wrong policy here. I think I have a separate one. Windows Hello for Business settings. Here we go. Probably don't need two OUs or two GPOs for that, huh? Thinking through that now. Windows settings, administrative templates, Windows components, Windows Hello for Business. There it is. And again, use Windows Hello for Business being the most crucial one. Select Enable, and your client machines will then use Windows Hello for Business. There are a number of other settings here that are crucial. Use biometrics. Should be enabled. If you don't enable this, it will actually give you the option to use biometrics. I like to enforce it just to ensure that that happens. But using biometrics means not just my PIN. It allows me to use my fingerprint or whatever facial recognition, whatever biometric devices my device supports. Like my device has a fingerprint reader. Most devices have that today. Most obviously have many, especially modern devices, have the camera that allow you to do facial recognition as well. So that one is obviously crucial, and there's a couple of other settings that I want to bring your attention to. This one is super important, and I didn't set this in my lab for a very important reason. I'll explain that in a second. But this is use a hardware security device. This basically forces Windows Hello for Business to use the TPM for private key, public key operations, or private key operations, meaning generate the key material, store the key material on the TPM. And again, as I'd mentioned before, this is absolutely vital to the fidelity of this system. If you are using software-based, and again, that's supported. So if you have devices that don't have TPMs, or you just don't want to manage TPMs, it is possible to do this in software, but the value of this system drops off precipitously. So using this setting and setting it in GPO in group policy means that I'm going to force my private key operations to be stored on the TPM. I have chosen not to do this in my lab because I do, from time to time, do some tests on virtual machines that don't have the TPM. I do have some, there is a way to set the virtual TPM in Hyper-V. You can actually do that and test that, but sometimes I get lazy, and so I want to do some quick and dirty testing, and so I'll leave that off. In a production environment, would strongly encourage you to enable this setting. There are some additional group policy settings here I want to bring your attention to. The first is PIN complexity. And I apologize if is this difficult to see out there? I don't know if I have Zoom in installed on this. Let me see if I do. Oh, I do. Cool. Great. Assistant journalist to the rescue. There we go. Now we can see this a little bit better. Sorry about that. There's a number of different, under this PIN complexity folder, there's a number of different settings that I want to bring your attention to. First of all, the two most important, at least for my purposes, are pin length, minimum and maximum pin length. By the way, let me ask this question. Does anybody have any security concerns about using short pins, right? In other words, 4-digit pins. Right? I mean, you would think, hey, man, 4-digit pin, that can't be difficult to guess, right? I'm kind of with you on that, but the general thinking is that pins are still more secure than passwords, or offer more security than passwords, simply because the pin is not the credential. The credential is the device. The pin just unlocks the device. It's very similar to the way in which we work with our ATM cards, right? I can tell you my pin right now. It doesn't do anybody any good unless you have my card. So the protection of the card, the physical protection of the card is really the crucial security aspect of that. And that's why we can get away with using the pin, because it really isn't the credential. It just unlocks the credential. That being said, I'm still uncomfortable with 4-digit pins, because to me, that does not, to me it provides an attacker a way to fundamentally guess that, I think, at least gives them more opportunity. My preference is to at least enforce a 6-digit pin. You can go as many as you want. You do have, and you'll notice here, there's a number of settings, like require digits, require uppercase and lowercase, and special character. I would encourage you to avoid turning this into a password, because we're trying to get away from passwords. We're trying to get away from the complexity and challenges of passwords. We don't want to make this so difficult that the user doesn't want to use it. And if you force them to use something long and complex here, you know what they're going to do? Excuse me. They're going to end up probably just pasting this right on their keyboard. Right, so it's going to defeat that purpose. Try to stick with 4 to 6 character, and I think you'll be a lot better off. But again, you do have that option. I would encourage you to at least make the pin length probably 6 characters. And by the way, there's one other option here I want to share with you. Phone sign-in. As I'd mentioned before, we do have the option to force multi-factor authentication for the actual PIN process. Sound good? All right. God dang. Sorry about that. Getting over something from last week, and I got a little tickle in my throat. We do have the ability to force the use of multi-factor authentication for the actual PIN process. Excuse me. Meaning, when I enter the PIN to unlock my device, I can actually force that to be a multi-factor authentication. I can force an Azure MFA event, meaning I have to accept the password or the authentication request on my phone. So in other words, I will enter my PIN, and then it will wait and ask me on my Windows Authenticator app to accept the authentication or accept the login. So you can extend multi-factor authentication to even the PIN process. So if you're really paranoid and you're really concerned with the security of the PIN process, you do have the ability to shore that up using multi-factor authentication. All right, let's see what else we're looking at here. So once we have those in place, again, we'd spoken about the options to use hardware device, the PIN complexity settings, and the phone sign-in. So we talked about all of those things. The user experience, what does that look like? Once the device has been provisioned for Windows Hello for Business, it's actually fairly simple and straightforward. The first time they log on to the device, they'll see this screen. So basically, your organization requires Windows Hello. You have to set a PIN. It requires you or forces you to set a PIN. By the way, you might be asking yourself, why do I need a PIN? Well, if fingerprints or facial recognition is better, what is the fundamental requirement of a PIN itself? And the reason is that there is no assurance or no guarantee that the biometric device will be available. In other words, I have to set a PIN because there may be a scenario in which the fingerprint reader doesn't work or is not available. or the facial recognition is not working or is available. Or my fingerprint, I had a woodworking accident and now I don't have a finger, right? So how do I, it's funny, but I mean, ultimately, they're taking into consideration those scenarios, right? Maybe it's just a cut and I have a Band-Aid or something like that. I can't use that now, and that's what I was using for this device. So at the end of the day, we do have to have the PIN. It's used as a fallback, and so the PIN is the first step of this process. So you'll create the PIN. At this point, you get challenged by Azure MFA for your credentials. So I will accept that on my phone, choose next, and then create a PIN. The PIN, of course, you saw the group policy objects. It will follow my prescriptive guidance there. So if I said, if I set complexity requirements, they would have to meet those. By the way, if I enter 1, 2, 3, 4 here, it will object. So it doesn't like simple pins, so you have some assurance that even in the defaults, that it's going to be fairly or reasonably secure. And after that, that's it. From now on, and of course, if this, by the way, if this device has a fingerprint reader or facial recognition capabilities, it would ask you if you wanted to create those. So let's go through this process. And by the way, I did this in screen caps just to make sure that I could show this to you, because sometimes this doesn't work. So let's jump into a host here. Okay, so I'm going to do this in my Hyper-V lab, virtual lab. And by the way, if you're doing this testing yourself, you can't do this in the enhanced session, because the enhanced session is fundamentally RDP, for which we don't have this capability. So you have to log on to the physical device first. And of course, this device doesn't have facial recognition or fingerprint, so we're just going to be able to do the PIN. But let's go ahead and log on and see how this works. My assumption here, of course, is that I've actually provisioned this VM for Azure AD. Let's see if I did. I think I did. And hopefully I didn't already log in. That may be the case. Let's see. Oh, good. Whew. Awesome. All right. So yeah, basically this is the setup. This is basically what I showed you before. So I'm going to set up a PIN, and it's going to then prompt me to approve the sign-in request, and I've got that here. So I've got Authenticator app here installed on my phone. Oops. Approve the sign-in request. It basically just says approve sign-in, allow or deny, approve, and we're off. Cool. Now I'm going to set my PIN. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's see if it accepts it. Nope. Provide a PIN that meets the complexity requirements. Let's see if it'll accept 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It may. Let's see. Nope. Your PIN can't be a common number PIN. So you can see that there are already some built-in mechanisms that prevent our users from, selecting poor pins, right? So we have some quality there. So let's find something that works. So we've entered something that should work, and of course they don't match. Let's see if we can do this again. Shoot. 1, 8. By the way, if you know the firing order for a small block Chevy, then you know my PIN. All set. That's it. And so at this point, from this point on, then of course the user can authenticate using their PIN. And again, as I'd mentioned before, if there's a biometric device assigned or available to this device, then it would ask me to set up a fingerprint or take a photo or do any of those sorts of things. So you can see, pretty straightforward and not terribly complex. Fundamentally, what did I do? I have Azure, I have on-premises AD running Windows Server 2016. I'm synchronized to, I have Azure AD Connect, I'm synchronizing to Azure AD. I made a couple of different settings in the detailed task on Azure AD Connect. So basically I had just to go in and choose a couple of other options. A couple of group policy objects, bam. I'm now enforcing strong multi-factor passwordless authentication from my Windows 10 devices. Pretty cool, huh? Right? I think it's pretty cool. And I was pleasantly surprised when I first got exposed to the technology that in some scenarios, it is not terribly difficult. So let me jump through that. Very good. So here's a couple of resources for you. By the way, as I'd mentioned before, there are many permutations of how you can implement Windows Hello for Business. This was one scenario, and unfortunately, given the time of just an hour for this session, I can't really go through many of the other scenarios because this one took most of the time anyway. But if you want to learn more about this, aka.ms, WHFB, so that stands for Windows Hello for Business. That will bring you to some good information. Also, AKMS Go Passwordless will bring you some additional information as well. Both of those resources will provide you with plenty of materials to do some further research and evaluate whether or not you can deploy Windows Hello for Business in your own organization. Would strongly encourage you to do so, but also would encourage you to get to modern operating systems and authentication because it makes your life infinitely easier, as you can see today. So that brings us to the end of our talk. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining me. I appreciate it. Thanks for getting up early and coming to the 8 o'clock session, and also making your way all the way to the back of the venue. Apparently, all the developers get the front row spots, but at the end of the day, we're here. Questions for anybody, gentlemen? So the question is, how would you manage group policy or manage, I guess, let me rephrase. How would you manage the Windows Hello for Business settings if you were not using on-premises AD, if you were using purely Azure Active Directory? At that point, you would be using Intune. So with Intune, it would allow you to basically implement the settings for Azure or for Windows Hello for Business through the CSP. So the whole management model with Intune is fundamentally different. It uses the configuration service providers, CSPs, and so it's a little bit different than group policy, but fundamentally it's the same. It's basically in Intune you would manage the devices and you would push many of these same settings or similar settings down using Intune as opposed to group policy. So the question is, if you were migrating from on-premises to pure cloud? So yeah, so the question is, if you're migrating from on-premises Active Directory and you're using group policy to deploy these settings, and you were migrating to a pure cloud deployment, then yes, the answer would be, if you're using on-premises AD, then it's easy to manage those settings with group policy. But as you migrate those users to pure cloud, so they're cloud only, then you would manage them using Intune and you would just implement those settings using Intune. Yes?
So you're not, with Windows Hello for Business, you're not really eliminating passwords from Active Directory? You're just...
Good question. So the question is, with Windows Hello for Business, you're not truly eliminating passwords from Active Directory. The answer is yes for now. Microsoft has a vision for getting to truly passwordless. And I think that that's probably coming in the future. I don't think we're quite ready for that because I think there's too many systems that require actual passwords. And there's also scenarios in which other systems, legacy systems, require you to log on with a password because they don't understand Windows Hello for Business. I think that that's coming in the future. But I think this is definitely a good start.
So does that require a central repository?
So the answer is, or the question is, does it still require a central repository for passwords? Yes. So fundamentally, what we're doing in the deployment model like I have today, there is still an Active Directory domain controller. It still has my passwords on it. But the question is, I really only use that for the initial provisioning process. and then once I'm using Windows Hello for Business, I'm not really using that anymore. It is possible, and I'm assuming that there are deployment models, even that are supported today, maybe if you meet all the requirements, I'm not certain, where you can actually, the next logical step would be literally to remove the passwords from Active Directory and never use them again. Because it is possible to provision a device and join it to Azure AD not using any sort of traditional Active Directory credentials. I think that that is a scenario, one in which we'll probably see in the future, and we'll eventually, that's the goal, right? That's the end goal, is to get to that point, but I don't think we're quite ready to get there yet. I think. Questions?
Yeah, so how will that work with the iOS device, mobile, as far as looking at your email, if you're asking for biometrics, and your device is your phone, how do you get your email and turn it on biometrics?
So good question. So the question is, how is it, so if we've implemented Windows Hello for Business, how is it that we authenticate, I guess, to rephrase your question a bit, authenticate using other platforms? Because Windows Hello for Business is Windows, right? It doesn't work on iOS or Android or something like that. So I have my iOS device. How do I authenticate to my identity provider and view my email? Well, in those cases, of course, you're going to use Azure AD credentials. That may be a scenario in which you're doing federation. I'm not certain, but fundamentally, you would still be able to do that in some other fashion. It might be certificate-based authentication. Again, it's probably more likely a federation scenario, but I'm sure there are avenues for which we can accomplish that. Questions?
Last one, not something near and dear to your heart that I saw you give last year and we went with, which is direct access.
Okay.
Will it have any effect on that model at all? And not only to deal with OTP or something like that?
So the question, and I'll paraphrase here, correct if I'm wrong. The question is, how does Windows Hello for Business affect mobility solutions like direct access? And importantly, if we're looking to the future of always-on VPN and how it work with that? Well, the answer is direct access is really a legacy technology now, and it is fundamentally tied to on-premises Active Directory, does not support Windows Hello for Business in any way, shape, or form. It would be something totally different. At the end of the day, Windows Hello for Business would integrate with always-on VPN because it's much more tightly coupled with Windows 10, and specifically, the always-on VPN is really designed to be more cloud integrated and cloud friendly and cloud centric, and so it would support authentication. Or in other words, if I were to authenticate with Windows Hello for Business, the token that I receive from the identity provider would be valid for the always-on VPN connection, and it would establish. So it would work. Other questions? Yeah?
So we have a lot of multi-user computers, so more than one user is
Uh-huh.
using the workstation. How does it work just as well for multi-user, or is it a single user solution?
So the question is, how does Windows Hello for Business work in a multi-user environment? I have multiple users logging onto the same device. It's a shared device. How does that work? Works very well because it's user-based, and each user would have access to the TPM under their context. The TPM is capable of storing multiple keys. So each user who logs on would simply go through that process where they would create a PIN. And that process, by the way, under the covers, basically generates a public-private key pair. The PIN encrypts the private key on the TPM. The public key is sent to the identity provider. And what that means is that each user who logs on just simply goes through the same process. So if I were to log on with another user on that same device, it would say, hey, your organization requires Windows Hello for Business. And it would walk through that process. And so it would literally be the same thing, only different. In other words, it's all stored. And by the way, for testing, I've logged on with 3 or 4 different users on my laptop, and I just keep using different fingers for the identity, and it works fine. Yeah, it's not a problem at all. I don't know that there's any sort of upper limit on the number of users. I don't expect there is, but no, not a problem at all.
So if users roll from shared device to shared device, they have to register?
Yes. So the question is, if a user goes from one device to another, Do their credentials roam? The answer is no. The credentials are tied to the device. So for example, I logged on to this virtual machine and went through the process of provisioning a PIN on that device. If I log on to another device that I've never logged on to, it's going to ask me for that same thing. It's going to say, hey, you need to create a PIN on this device. Because remember, Windows Hello for Business, and this is the critical point. Windows Hello for Business is a credential that is not shared. It is tied to the device. The device really is crucial and key, the TPM ultimately. And so every time you log into a different device, then ideally it should have a TPM, and you have to go through that same process. But then as I log onto each device, then I would have credentials on that device. And that's the advantage, is because then those credentials are of no value to an attacker because they have to have the physical device. Whereas if I steal your username and password right now, I can use it from any machine in the world. Whereas Windows Hello for Business prevents that. That's the whole benefit and selling point for Windows Hello for Business.
Is there a limit on the device the person can have registered under?
I'm sorry, what was the question again?
Is there a limit to how many devices a person can visit?
Oh, so the question is there a limit to how many devices a user can register? No. No, I could be registered on 100 devices. It really wouldn't matter. No, not at all. No, not a problem at all. Any other questions at all? Yes, sir.
So related to the question about how many devices, I think that this still plays into the factor of you can allow only a user to log on only to some specific devices. It will deny access based on the link for saying, hey, you do not allow to log in.
Correct. So the question is, and I'll restate. So the question is there a way to restrict how many devices or which devices a user can authenticate to? Absolutely. Right. So I mean, you could literally state, and again, that's an Active Directory attribute, right? You can say this user can only log on to this machine or this group of machines or what have you, and then that would prevent them from logging on everywhere else. Yeah, certainly if you wanted to do that. I don't know if there's a way to do that in MDM, but certainly in traditional Active Directory, there's a way to do that as well. But yeah. Any other questions at all?
On the, like, we have a couple software packages so that I would get from by countries. I allowed the LDAP integration. Would that kind of break that?
So the question is, if you have an application that, let me restate, if you have an application that doesn't use Active Directory for authentication, that uses,
It uses the LDAP integration on like a couple of our software.
okay, so the application uses Active Directory, but not in the traditional way, it does an LDAP lookup.
Yeah.
Okay, so I would say that Windows Hello for Business would probably break that because, unless, and you'll have to tell me, the way Windows Hello for Business works is that fundamentally it's getting a Kerberos ticket. It's just doing it in a fundamentally different way. Whereas traditional usernames and passwords, I have to enter my password, it gets salted and hashed and sent to the repository. It compares and says, yeah, you must have entered the same thing because I ran the same hash algorithm and got the same output, so you must have the right password. Here's your ticket. In this way, we're actually doing some cryptographic operations to do the same thing, fundamentally the same thing, without sharing those credentials. But at the end of the day, I still get a Kerberos ticket. So if your application does something different than Windows Hello for Business would probably break that. But if your application can work, if it just has a Kerberos ticket and it doesn't care how it got it, whether it got it the traditional way or whether it got it using Windows Hello for Business, the ticket's the ticket, right? And we're good to go. So most applications will work, but if you're using, custom authentication methods like LDAP or SQL or something like that, then those might tend to break.
Currently, you still have a password, right?
Correct.
In Active Directory?
Correct.
The LDAP authentication works.
Correct, but in that case, it may prompt you, right? In that case, it may prompt you. In other words, there may be an additional prompt, right? In other words, because I didn't type it in when I logged in, maybe my application doesn't. I don't know. I'm not certain. I'm not necessarily an application developer, so the behavior of individual applications might fundamentally be different. I don't know. Yes, sir.
How does, for
So how does Windows Hello support password changes? So password changes are fundamentally different than biometric changes. In other words, changing your password really doesn't matter to Windows Hello for Business. Windows Hello for Business is really all about the protection of the private keys on the device itself. So you can change your password, that doesn't really affect Windows Hello for Business. If you want to change your biometrics, in other words, you want to use a different fingerprint or a different photo, what you end up doing, the technical process is the key is actually unlocked, and then that key is destroyed, and a new key is created. And then the key pair basically gets regenerated, or excuse me, not the key pair, the protector key. So it's important to understand there's two different types of keys when we're talking about Windows Hello for Business. There's the actual private key, and then there's the protector key, which is assigned to the biometric. And you might have multiple protector keys. So I can have a protector key for my PIN, I have a protector key for my fingerprint, and I have a protector key for my facial recognition. They all encrypt the same private key. And the public key for that private key is in the identity provider. So if I want to change my PIN, I basically, like for example, a PIN change would affect Windows Hello for Business in that when I try to do a PIN change, it will unlock the private key with that protector key, destroy that protector key, I create a new PIN which creates a new protector key. Didn't affect my other biometrics like my fingerprint and my facial recognition, but fundamentally it changed that one. But that's totally separate and distinct from the traditional Active Directory password change. That would be totally separate. That wouldn't affect Windows Hello for Business. Anybody else? Good? Yes, sir.
Just a comment related to that. We don't have Windows Hello deployed throughout for some people in IT, they did do the manual deployment of Windows Hello with fingerprint.
Yeah.
Every time you change your password, the first time when you log out of your account and you log back in, you cannot use the fingerprint log in. It's asking for
So it does make you change your...
It doesn't make me change my fingerprint or my PIN, but it doesn't allow me to log in with the fingerprint or with the PIN. It says you need to use your password just this one time.
Yeah.
And after you log in, I think it just kind of ties up everything all together, and then I can log off and I use my fingerprint anymore.
Interesting, okay. But it didn't require you to basically re-swipe your finger then, right?
No.
Okay.
It says that the first time after you change your password, I use your password.
Oh, okay, yes.
And then you can log off and use fingerprint or PIN.
Interesting, huh?
It's like a configuration.
Yeah, interesting, okay. And then that may be something separate, kind of a separate channel, but it doesn't fundamentally change anything that Windows Hello for Business does or has. Yeah.
They just want to be verified that you change your password.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Good. Good deal. Anything else? Anyone?
You've rolled this out for your customers, for your clients somewhere?
No. No, it's a funny thing. It's a funny thing you should ask. I'm having a lot of discussions with customers about this. Done this in a couple of limited pilots, just to kind of kick the tires on it. But I don't have any customers today, and the question is, have I rolled this out in a production deployment? And the answer is no, because no one's quite ready for it yet. It's like we're talking about it a lot, you know? It's like, the concept is awesome, right? The concept is awesome. Let's get rid of passwords. I mean, the selling points are huge. But at the end of the day, there's some requirements that have to be met. And a lot of customers just aren't there yet. I'm surprised, excuse me, I'm surprised at how many organizations still haven't moved to Windows Server 2016 for domain controllers. I still have a lot of customers that have a heavy reliance on Server 2008 R2 still today. And to me, that's funny because, yeah, and again, you know, I get it. I used to work for an insurance company. We moved slow as molasses, right? And I get it. But at the end of the day, man, we're talking about, what is that, 11-year-old operating system now almost? Man, in terms of security, that is an eternity, right? I mean, just upgrading to Server 2016 and doing nothing else buys you so much more in terms of security and performance and things like that, and manageability and whatnot. So, but, you know, I get it. We live in the real world. Sometimes it's challenging to get things done like that. I mean, certainly, I used to work with Bank of America. We had hundreds of thousands of servers. You know, you didn't do anything on a whim. It did take a long time. But the upside, the win is so big, I would just think that at some point you got to make that effort, right? Anyone else? Good deal. Thanks everybody for joining me. My information's there. If you want to connect with me on social media, you can do that. But thanks for coming. Please fill out your evaluations, not just for this session, but for everybody else. We like that information. It's helpful for us, and I appreciate it again. Thanks for coming. Appreciate it.